want to say good evening to you all. We have a lot of local folks tuning in, and tonight is going to be a little bit different for Parked at Home. Typically, we are partnering with a park ranger who is coming to us from far away or for somewhere very different. And tonight, due to some unforeseen circumstances, we are just going to be talking to each other. So I'm joined by a park ranger from the Blackstone River Valley. My name is Allison Horrocks, and I'm joined tonight by Mark Mello. And so we are kind of literally parked at home, and we will be talking tonight about music in the Blackstone Valley and industrialization and music. So please feel free to keep leaving in the chat where you are joining us from. I want to get us started tonight, and I'm going to start to screen share with talking a little bit about what Parked at Home is, where we've traveled so far this year, which has been 6 amazing places, and then a little bit more about what to expect from us tonight. So I'm going to go ahead and share screen. Okay. So for those of you who have been able to join us either this year or last year for Parked at Home, you know that we have already been to some really extraordinary places. We started this series in 2022 as a way to keep exploring both deeper stories about our national park and your national park, Blackstone River Valley, and as a way to get a better understanding of how some themes from our park might connect to other places. And for some of those themes, we've looked at concepts such as labor or work. We've gone deep into company towns. If you recall, last week we were out in Skagway, Alaska, talking about why a company town or the drive to move out to a place like that is going to be different from the construction of a place like Slatersville, which is part of our local national park in the Blackstone Valley. This is a short list of where we've traveled so far this year. We've been to some pretty amazing places together. And tonight we're going to be talking about our landscape in the Blackstone Valley in a different way. Often we use a lot of visuals. We really go kind of deep and do some comparisons into what different places might look like. And tonight we're going to be using a different sense. We're going to be talking a lot about sound. When you visit a historic mill building, there are certain things that you can appreciate that give you a connection to our oral past, to the way that the past might have sounded, or to how people experience noise. And something I read in preparing for this program that really stuck with me was this idea that while we have eyelids, we all have a way that we can escape visual impacts at some point. We don't have earlids. So if we have the capacity to hear, it's something that is very hard to actually block out once we are experiencing the world or being lucky enough to visit a national park. Or if we don't have that power or that ability to hear in certain ways, we still feel sound. We feel the effects of sounds through vibrations. And that's especially true in industrial contexts. Now, there's this really great connection too between work, which is our central theme in the Blackstone River Valley, and music. And if you've already shared with us in the chat where you are joining us from, I'd love for you to also add a song that makes you think about work, or a way that you connect music to work together. Just thinking about different songs that might evoke something about labor, I came up with these few on the slide. Some of you might think of historic songs, like I've Been Working on the Railroad or Hard Day's Night by the Beatles. Dolly Parton gives us 9 to 5. And of course we have Manic Monday. So all different kind of portrayals of work in song. Where we're going to head tonight is we're going to think about the past, and we're going to think about music and work and culture together from a few different dimensions. And I want to talk briefly about a project that we recently were undertaking at the mill that I think gave us an even deeper appreciation for how all of this comes together. We were very fortunate, Mark and I and our colleagues, to work with a local dance troupe, and we decided that we were going to film. So we were going to record a dance that they had created about an important event in US history. Close to 200 years ago, a group of women rallied together to create the first industrial wage workers strike. This is an event that we commemorate in Pawtucket now each year in May or June to kind of honor that important action that they took. And this dance troupe wanted to work with us to find a way to honor that moment through what they do, which is dance. You will not find Mark and I dancing to this event or about this event, nor will we be singing at any point in this program. Part of what made this a really special collaboration is we were able to bring what I think are different gifts to the process, which was not me singing or dancing. But we were able to talk about primary sources from the strike, so real accounts of people who experienced this. We were also able to create Foley. We made files of noises that these people would have heard while working in the mills. And working with dancers, choreographers, and people who think through video and audio, we were able to create something together where we basically created a soundtrack to this experience of this first strike. And something that we came across while researching this was also the power of silence. When the group of women who were going to lead this walkout, lead this strike in 1824, got together to plan some of what they were about to do, they understood that they had actually been infiltrated. And there is an amazing account that discusses what they did at their meeting, which is they stayed silent. So they understood that while they were having this planning session, someone had come in and they didn't want them to know exactly what they were planning. So you can imagine all the chaos that these women usually hear while working in the mill, all of the excitement and all of the energy that's building up around this mass action. And we know that there would be a lot of noise, a lot of confusion. And when these women were trying to plan an action together, they'd have to try to do so while talking over loud machinery. Then we have that juxtaposed with this amazing moment where they've already had enough conversations, they're having this planning meeting in secret, and they get absolutely silent. Such an amazing visual, an amazing thing to try to imagine to put us back in their position. We also know that part of the objection to this strike was the fact that they made a lot of noise. When these women and their community members continued to protest both a reduction in their wages and shorter time for eating, they decided to go through the streets, and there were accounts that they were slinging insults, that they were screaming and shouting and making all manner of noise. I bring this up because one of the ways that we connect with the past is by touring people through historic spaces and getting them to connect through a sensory experience. We often say that we want people to fully immerse themselves in the sensory experience of a place like Slater Mill through everything but taste. We welcome people to really think critically about what it would sound like, how people might have smelled when they walked out of the mill for a whole day, to really activate their senses and appreciate the sound of a rushing river that creates water power, the way that cotton lint would be filling the air. All of these things are just other ways for us to better understand something like that strike or something else about the past. Now, I want to see what people have been sharing about their own work. Sorry, I lost my mouse here, folks. Nobody's perfect. Okay, so we have some great things so far. 9 to 5, we have Bread and Roses. So I bring all of this up about our work with this dance troupe because we often appreciate that mills and historic sites that we are able to actually see, we hope, something that the people of the past would have seen. We get to watch a machine function as it would have been. We get to have all of these different sensory experiences. But part of what Mark and I wanted to talk about tonight is the sounds, right? Is the actual sound landscape that people would have lived in. And to talk about that distinction between where does noise begin, or where does music begin and noise end? What separates the rhythm of a machine from the rhythm of your favorite song? How did people learn to cope with working next to loud, noisy, clattering machines every single day? That's part of what we wanted to talk about tonight. So discussed a bit about this. Oh, sorry, go ahead. So we talked a bit about this video and our collaboration, and Mark and I are going to talk a little bit about what it was actually like to be around these machines and how do we know. There are famous photographs that give us some insight into how workers would have been positioned next to their machines, or that give us some sense of other aspects of their experience. This worker that we have on our slide right now is fortunate because they are seated. And something that I love about this image is we can imagine these two women possibly trying to have a conversation. And this would have been extremely challenging because all around them, there would have been machines making an incredible amount of noise. I use the word incredible because it's not currently legal to fully replicate how loud it would have been in some of these industrial contexts. Keep that in mind as I tell you this brief story and this encounter that Samuel Slater had while inspecting a mill. He was not in Pawtucket. He was out and he was touring through a factory that he owned elsewhere in Massachusetts. And it's something I think about a lot. And I want you to try to visualize this as you look at this image of the two women at the warp beam. So, what's on the slide right now? He says, I shall always recollect with pleasure an incident in one of the weaving rooms of the manufactory, where the noise was very distracting, arising from a vast number of looms going at once. The machinery suddenly stopped, and a strain of music arose simultaneously from every part of the room, in such perfect concord that I at first thought of it the chime of bells. My conductor smiled when I asked him if it was not, and pointed to the girls, who each kept their station until they had sung the tune through. So Samuel Slater is walking into a factory. The machinery, which has been making all of this noise and capturing all of his attention, suddenly comes to a halt. And above the sound of that machinery are women singing together. And you might ask yourself why they are doing this. Their ears and their bodies would have been so well attuned to the sound and clatter of that machinery by that point that they had trained themselves to be able to talk or to sing over the sound of that machine. I had a very hard time understanding this quote until I talked to a sound engineer about it. And I explained that I simply didn't understand it. I didn't understand how people could sing, never mind why they would try to sing over the sound of the machinery. And he explained it to me this way. He pulled out a recording device and he had me talk while machines, power looms, were running nearby. And he very quickly showed me that my voice registered somewhere completely different than the sound of the machines. And once we knew how to look for it, we could see that my voice was doing something very different than this kind of hum and thrum of a piece of textile machinery. So these women would have been trained, not something that you can teach in a classroom, but only on the factory floor to know how to communicate. Remember back to that story about the strike, how these women would have been extremely difficult to plan something. They're always working around loud machines. Finally get the chance to have a meeting and they choose to be silent. Remember that when Samuel Slater first enters the factory, he doesn't hear them. He thinks that it's something else. That's extremely valuable. It means that people had found very particular, very careful ways to speak with each other, even in these environments. I like to imagine that they had beautiful voices, and maybe this was a pleasant thing for them to listen to. But I think, like a lot of things, we become attuned to our own alarm clocks, the sounds or the voices of people that we really care about. It must have been really comforting to be at your machine and to know that no matter how loud it was, how hard it was vibrating, you could connect with someone through music. And that's something I think about a lot. Mark, from here, we're going to talk in a slightly different direction about music, about work, or different ways that people connected through song. Do you mind sharing with me what other songs people have put in the chat?
Sure. Yeah. No, there's been some great answers that folks have been putting in. Money by Pink Floyd. I think we're going to maybe loop back to Pink Floyd in a little bit.
We
Working
actually
for
are.
the weekend. The Beatles, 8 days a week. One of my personal favorites, which already appeared on the slide. Working 9 to 5 by Dolly Parton. So a whole bunch of Work by Rihanna. Money, Money, Money by ABBA. So a whole bunch of awesome answers, and perhaps we all listen to these songs as we're at work. I know I enjoy to listen to music too, and it helps me to get through the day. And I think that that kind of is something that is a shared experience between us and the folks of the past, right? In many ways, music helping us to get through the day. I worked at New Bedford Whaling National Historical Park for a while. One of the things that we talked a lot about there was sea shanties. They may not be for everybody, but they did serve a purpose among the working class on whaling ships and other merchant mariner ships. And oftentimes they would sing about their experiences, the things that they experienced, what they went through as whalers or some other kind of merchant mariner, the things that they had seen, great tales of heroics and things like that. But do we have any clue, I guess, Allison, of what were people who worked in mills singing about? Do we have any indication of what were their songs like? What were they singing about? What was their experience that they were trying to bring about in song? We obviously cannot know. Slater does not tell us what the women who were working in the weaving room were singing about. But what kind of examples do we have of what kind of music that they may have sang?
We know through certain protest moments as well as other documentation that there were certain songs that people would have had as a kind of common language. And some of those songs would have come from their religious background. So remember that if you worked in a mill in the early 19th century, at least in the Blackstone Valley, there would have been an expectation that you spend your seventh day of the week, your Sabbath in that case, at church. And so that would have provided a common language for people because at church, singing would have been part of their experience. So there would have been religious songs and different spiritual songs that they would have shared in common. We also know from 1830s protests that there were songs that women had rewritten themselves. So there was an anti-Catholic song called I Shall Not Be a Nun, and women in certain mills had rewritten that song to protest their working conditions. So songs that people all knew well enough that they could rewrite them for their own situation. There were also songs that people wrote about the workers like people in the Blackstone Valley. So the left broadside, which would have been printed out for people to read or to distribute, is the Factory Girls song. So this is about people who are actually working in mills and factories, particularly women. And I put that alongside Patty on the Canal, which is a song about male canal workers. Now, something really important is we have this printed culture, which tends to be about the people. And then we have the oral culture, which is from the people and by the people. And to your point, just like with sea shanties, we know that folks who are working alongside canals, they are singing for a few reasons. They're singing in the same way that a coworker might sing in their cubicle today to like pass the time and kind of as a coping mechanism. I don't sing because then others would need their own coping mechanisms. That's neither here nor there, but they're also singing to communicate with each other, that particularly on ships and in really hard labor situations, the rhythm of a song may actually give them a baseline. So if you ever see people performing a shanty, there's usually a dual purpose. We also know that there's another genre of song that relates to our story in the Blackstone Valley, which is that people who were enslaved and working on plantations, they would also sing. That would be part of how they would pass the time or how they would communicate. We also know that in their instances, often singing was a way to talk to each other about things they weren't supposed to talk about. And sometimes there would be a spiritual element to their song. Some of these get printed and mass distributed later. Often they were done so in a way that had offensive language, but we know that in the true oral culture of people who worked on plantations, singing was a really important and valuable way to communicate sometimes outside of the surveillance of people like overseers who were watching them. Do you have a favorite song at work? Maybe I don't know this.
Um, Man, I don't know if I have a favorite song at work because it depends on the day. But I think that, that opportunity that music provides us, right? That if maybe you're not having the best day or you need to refocus or recenter yourself, right? Music can provide that opportunity for folks. Or if you want to really get drummed up for something and get excited about something, music can also serve that means. And when we talk about that, and you've kind of already alluded to the camaraderie in the sense
Mm.
of community and being that music can bring to certain atmospheres, I think what better time than to talk a little bit more about uh, the union movements and strikes and the power that music can have when it comes to being sung by a group of individuals, by a group of workers who may be protesting something. A few years back, we did a presentation on the 1913 strike in Hopedale. Can we talk a little bit maybe about that story of that particular strike and some of the songs that the workers may have been singing there and kind of what that did for the group of strikers, these people who were protesting
Yeah.
unjust labor conditions?
We know that particularly around the time of the French Revolution, around the time of the opening of Slater Mill, there are two things that are going to happen that are going to change people's music culture and their awareness of music. As more and more places start to industrialize, you also start to see a change in how easy it is to get more music instruments. We have the industrialization of the process of making music. We also have more people who can spread broadsides like what we're seeing here or sheet music with each other. We're going to talk in just a little bit about Worcester's role in actually creating a more vibrant music culture, not just in this area, but in the United States. But to your point, we have documents that people would sing together and that it was a valuable form of communication. We also know that if you were on the other side of these strikes, that management and other people become extremely irritated because, much like many social movements, people are using song to bind themselves together and to also create a kind of in group and out group. So if you're against these strikes, you might be hearing people singing in your community at all hours. We know that in Hopedale, they actually start to restrict public performance of song in 1913. That's not a coincidence because they know that people are singing to pull themselves closer together. We know that it has this really valuable social role. And we also know that if you're on the opposing side of the strike and you live right in Hopedale, that's probably starting to get on your nerves a little bit. You're hearing people sing all the time. Now, speaking of getting on your nerves, I am not a one alarm clock person. I am a 9 alarm clock person. There are many bells, there are many whistles, there are many alarms to wake me up in the morning. I don't know that I would have done so well in a company town like Whitensville or Hopedale, where responding to a particular bell is important because that is how you know that you are supposed to get up, go to work, have a meal break. I included in here two different visuals, one of which is an old mill complex where they did cotton spinning and processing in Whitensville, Massachusetts. We have a bell tower. That bell tower would have been a communication tool with people in the community. And I also wanted to give a glimpse of what is to come. We have people singing in mills. We have a lot of noise in mills. We have very serious industrial machinery, the likes of which are being produced in Whitensville. We have bells telling people when to go to and from work. And then we're going to see these two stories meld together. Started to look at big players in the industry of making music. And one of them is Kahn's Band Instrument Factory. They actually had a merge with an important production company that was based out of Worcester. And I'll talk about them in just a minute. But when you start to look at industrial landscapes, it becomes almost impossible to not notice the things that would have made noise. We know that we have trains coming through. We know that we have lots of people making machines or using machines, and that is plenty noisy. But we also almost always have these towers, and these towers hold bells to give us important messages. They're going to tell people when to go to or from work. They're also going to be used as emergency signals, right? So not so different from our world today. We also know in some communities that cutting the cord in the bell tower was a way that workers asserted power. There are stories about Whitinsville where that occurred. There's also evidence that in Pawtucket, people would try to change the different ringing of the bells to manipulate time. We know that mill owners got busted doing this and demanding longer workdays out of their workers. And we also know that workers would try to do this to get more time back in their days as well.
Wow, pretty fascinating. And you know, that asserting of power, right? Something as simple as a bell and the sound of a bell can have so much power over the working class people, over those who lived in a community. So that's pretty astonishing that would happen. Um, could you tell us a little bit more too, maybe on this topic of the mass production of things like instruments, right? And the availability of music. You kind of hinted at this with the production of instruments, but how does that shape the ability for people living in an industrial setting? Right, prior to this, prior to industrialization, instruments are not something that everybody necessarily can have, and the instruments that anybody can have sometimes are what they could make or what they could form. So kind of finding music in things that they had and things that they possessed that they could manipulate to create a song out of, or to cause that music that they wanted to sing to. But with the mass production of instruments, what is the effect that can have on a community's ability to provide music and to enjoy music in a place?
So today, it probably seems like there's almost infinite ways to access music, right? There are live venues that you can go to where you can hear all different forms of music. You can also pretty much carry a supercomputer in your pocket and access something if you want to. When we were conducting research on that strike in Hopedale in 1913, we looked up the specific songs that they performed and we heard recordings in the native language. We heard recordings in Italian and French, and we were able to hear the instrumental. That's a privilege of living in the 21st century that would have been unthinkable to early factory workers. So initially, when we talk about mills in the Blackstone Valley, we're talking about textile mills. We're talking about places where people are, for example, at Slater's Mill in Pawtucket, they are improving the process by which they are turning cotton into thread. But it doesn't take long for other processes to undergo a similar change. And so musical instruments in the 1700s, those are a pretty unique and special thing. It's either something that you made or a craftsperson made for you. And by 1900, so within about a century, increasingly that's going to change. We know that Isaac Fisk out of Worcester, his company is actually going to be merged with that Kahn Manufacturing. So the photo of the people making instruments in a factory, those two are actually going to merge. This is a very good example of what will occur over the late 1800s. Someone like an Isaac Fisk who develops a certain system for making instruments like a flugelhorn will be bought out by someone who is starting to do mass production. We also know that someone in Worcester is going to create the predecessor to the player piano. Here it's called piano player. Part of what this particular gentleman did, Theodore Brown, is he took out a series of patents. He actually patented the different kind of components that make a player piano. So this is a piano that plays itself. Something had to happen before we could even get there. Pianos had to be standardized, which hadn't occurred until about the 1800s. So to be able to make an instrument that can play itself, everyone basically has to agree how this instrument is going to work. You'll sometimes see that Ted Brown created the player piano. That would be cool for this presentation. Found out it's not exactly true. What he actually does in Worcester is he creates and patents certain advances in technology that create the basis for the player piano. And he does actually have a successful business in his own right. But for a long time, there were basic things that people couldn't take for granted. Let's say you were out in society and you told people that you could play a piano. Folks' pianos would look and sound very different. Part of what's occurring in the 1800s is they're standardizing process after process. So it's no longer a random craftsperson or someone in your community who makes you a musical instrument. We have companies like Kahn, and then we have people like Theodore Brown who are standardizing that music process. That's happening as part of the larger industrial revolution, something we may not really tend to think about as part of that social change.
But an important part nonetheless, right? I think that that's something so valuable that we talk about at Slater Mill with folks when they come. The idea that the Industrial Revolution may start with textiles and maybe the mass production of a textile. But at the end of the day, it's that principle of mass production and standardization, which allows, on the one hand, for the ability to produce a whole lot more, which can make things cheaper and more marketable on the one hand, but also maybe potentially losing that personal craft and that skill, right? A distinct difference between an instrument that is crafted by a craftsperson's hands, taking maybe months or a year to produce, versus an instrument that is mass produced within the course of a week in a factory system. So that give and take relationship that comes with the standardization and the mass production of a single good. But on the other hand, right, we can look at places like Ashton or any number of mill villages. Again and again we talk about the community aspects that existed within these mill villages, whether that's the baseball team. That's the one that we tend to always talk about because people really like baseball, but there also were company bands that were in these mill villages. And a thing like a company band is not necessarily something that could be affordable in a time and a place when instruments are not mass produced in a mill. So they kind of play hand in hand together. But again, we see at the root of this music kind of forming that basis of a community and giving people something to come together around, and certainly making it more accessible with something like a player piano. Which I still cannot wrap my head around how a player piano works. And yet the technology has been around for so long, but we only see this increasing today, right? To your point, with phones in our pockets, and how easily and readily available music is to each and every one of us still to this day.
We're also fortunate to have a very particular kind of narrow frame loom at Slater Mill. And it has what looks like this extremely strange series of pegs and these small wooden slats on the side of it. And what it actually is a program. And that program is part of how that machine knows how to make a certain kind of design. And if you've seen a modern player piano play out, it has what looks like a long roll of paper with all little holes punched inside of it. And so we can track that technology back to looms. So when looms were programmed to function a certain kind of way, it looks just like something with a whole bunch of holes or a bunch of wooden strips with pegs inside of it. That's actually how they created the technology for something like a player piano. And that's the basis for modern computing. So all of these things do actually go together. Now, people are going to use music to get through their workday. They're also going to use music to try to convince people maybe we should just be working a whole lot less. Famously, the IWW, which was a big tent union around the time that the player piano was becoming more available, you could see it was still pretty expensive. They were also known as the I Won't workers, sometimes in a nice way, sometimes in a disparaging way. But people would take popular songs, just as they had centuries before, and they would sing together their own version. So this song on the side, To the Tune of America, is about J.D. Rockefeller, but it is kind of a pun on My Country 'Tis of Thee, but it's critiquing this industrialization process. So this is something that people have done for a very long time. They've taken a song as a kind of common connection point, and laborers are going to use this as a form of protest. As you mentioned before, we know these specific songs usually because people are writing about these incidents, not thrilled with the Free Public concert. So if people are passerby or they are witnessing this strike, they are usually the ones to tell us about people singing songs like the ones we have on this slide. The song La Internationale, that dates all the way back to the Revolutionary era. People are going to take these songs and make of them what they will for their own social movements. And part of why I included these is the fact that they could mass produce the sheet music. That's part of how these things are going around the world. I wanted to just give people some information on that video that we do have coming out. That will be debuting in about a week or so. So the video I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, you will be able to see how that actually turned out. So you'll be able to see people interpreting that first strike event in the form of dance and song. You'll also be able to hear from some primary source material about that event in the video, kind of an interesting soundtrack. We also have some other events coming up at the park that feature music. So we do like to really be a space where people can practice their art, where they can bring their musical instruments and share their gifts with us. But I wanted to end by looking at this quote, which gives, I think, a different perspective about all of this. So I mentioned at the beginning that there can be a fine line between noise and music. A lot of that really depends on the perception of either the person performing or the person receiving and listening to it. And we know that when people wrote about the noise that they encountered in that first generation of industry, sometimes they're comparing it to what they knew before. There is famously a document where a mill worker says that it's like Niagara is in her ears. So she knew that Niagara Falls was very loud. She's trying to make sense of how loud the machinery is. So she compares those two things. And people make a lot of natural comparisons. This comes from another mill worker who talks about how she actually basically decides that she will become accustomed, that she will get used to this noise, so it will become like a silence because she wants to have a kind of mastery over this. I mentioned that we have the Slater incident where the women are singing above the machines, but we also know that in a more figurative way, even when they're not literally singing, people often made a decision to say that they would rise above the literal din and clatter of these machines, and they would have their mind transcend the sound that is all around them. I was thinking about different music that people might bring up tonight, and I said someone might bring up Pink Floyd. It's the 50th anniversary of Dark Side of the Moon. And I think a lot about their music that incorporates industrial noise or kind of gets at different elements of industry, ideas like being a brick in the wall, all those concepts. And in one of their songs, they refer back to that bell, right? That noise that would have been so important in different industrial communities. And these two different passages I have here, one is from Pink Floyd and one is from a mill worker. And what really struck me is how their language is not so different, right? Music often provided workers with a common language. And part of why people visit a historic mill is they want to be part of that soundtrack. They want to hear the machinery. They want to feel it. They want to have an experience in that space. And there is no comparison to hearing a machine run with the backdrop of the river to even get a taste of those experiences. So music has been used to critique this system, to transcend this system, but I think industry is also itself a kind of music. So if you join us in the Blackstone Valley and you come for a concert, or you hear one of our historic machines, or you are part of any kind of event, I think you are part of making that music too. So we hope that you are able to visit us. And if you are not, maybe listen to some Pink Floyd and ring some bells for us. But we really all do have a connection to this moment in industry because it's changed something as basic as how we share music with each other.